go back to, I wanted to read something that Taju says about colonialism. Because some people seem to think that colonialism, has ended in Africa, and I was glad Professor Campbell said that we need to still fight colonialism. It says, Taju said in a postcard written on the 7th of December 2006, entitled Africa Without Borders. He says, whenever Pan-Africanists talk about colonialism, critics always say we're escapists and too focused on the past, blaming colonialism, when in their view, colonialism finished a long time ago. My retort has always been, how I wish. The impact of colonialism is so pronounced in our lives that even our physical geography is determined by its shameful past. For instance, go to any of the fancy hotels on the continent and ask for the breakfast menu. The option you will be given in many places is continental breakfast. But the continent will not be referring to the African continent. Right? If you ask for African meals, Nigerian hotels being exceptions in terms of always having African foods, many of them will tell you that they needed 24 or 48 hours notice. Yet they can offer you all kinds of so-called international cuisine. And then he goes on, in Francophone countries, choices of cheeses and wines from particular regions of France are available on demand. So he goes on to talk about other aspects of the need for citizenship, Pan-African citizenship, and so on. But there are lots of examples here in this Speaking Truth to Power, where Taju tackles the issue of Pan-Africanism. And one of the things he refers to, and I've mentioned it earlier, and others have picked it up, the necessity for the emancipation of women on the continent. Okay? There's no way that Africa is going to develop without tapping into the organizational capacity of the African women. We know it's there already, but it's latent. And I think there's a necessity for us to start to make it active. And African women are mobilized, right? But they're mobilized within the context of NGOs. Right? And non-governmental, you might say, well, these are civil society organizations. But they're not. The agenda of these NGOs are not coming from the women themselves. Right? So the agenda might change depending on the mood in the West, depending on the faddish agenda of the donors. Right? I remember once actually going to a conference organized by an African NGO in Kenya in the mid-1990s. And we were all debating where we should go. And one of the women, a Kenyan woman working for an NGO not far from here, said, I am tired of this. Last week we were supposed to be working on urban whatever. Now this week they say we're supposed to be working on that. But we haven't finished that problem yet. We haven't solved the problem over there. And that's the tragedy of NGO activity in Africa. Right? Once the funds run out, or once the donors' agenda change, it's no longer our agenda. And the full emancipation of women need concerted action. It needs organization. When we look at, and the other issue I'm very passionate about is the issue of black women in general. Right? Because some of you will have heard about the scholar, if I want to call him scholar, at LSE, who claimed that black women are not beautiful because they have, I think, too much testosterone or whatever. And I was thinking, what? Wow! How can this man define? Who is he talking about? Which black? I was thinking anyway, shades of black. There's so many different shades of black, right? So who is he talking about? What's this? And I said to myself, this is actually, the fact that he can say this thing, I noticed the LSE students are campaigning to get him, to get him sacked, which is good on them. But the fact that he can say this thing suggests, right, that black women, certainly during the 1970s, when I was growing up, as a young teenager, right, we were proud, and we were black and we were proud, right? And it suggests to me that the whole issue of racism is, probably was later, but has come to the fore. And the whole issues about racial hierarchies and what constitutes beauty is still something that we have to, as African women, we have to tackle. And not just African women, white women as well. Because the whole ideal of beauty is something that we can't actually realize unless we physically commoditize our bodies, right? Unless we go under the knife, right? So the ideals of beauty, are manufactured, I would say, by corporations. And we have to work together to tackle this. So the issue of the emancipation of women, I think is central. The issue of women coordinating and organizing together. You might say, some people say feminists over. It's only just beginning. It's really only just beginning. And we have the space to, we have the space and we to mobilize. So that's the other thing. With regards to women in Africa, Taj was very particular, very, very keen to support women, and not just even keen to support. He was a feminist, right? And he was a feminist because he grew up in a Muslim household, where his mother virtually looked after him. A Muslim household with several wives, and his mother looked after him. And his mother died young, and he's in childbirth, I think. And his sister also. I think he lost one or two sisters in childbirth as well. So he was really passionate. He said, let me read you an extract, if I can find it. Yeah, he says, while citizens should stand up and speak out to draw attention to the alarming numbers of women who continue to die while giving birth, governments in turn must develop national action plans for the reduction of maternal mortality that adopt a human rights approach supported by strong institutions, funding and accountability mechanisms. Special attention should be given to marginalized groups in health system strategies, and all efforts should be made to guarantee the meaningful participation of women and communities in the designing, development, implementation and monitoring of programs and policies to combat maternal deaths. And he says it is not morally or politically right, and it cannot be acceptable that mothers die giving life. And in many, we know that during the I think Professor Campbell mentioned this, during the 1980s and early 1990s, and even now when structural adjustment was introduced, women died because they had to pay to go and give birth during complications, pay to go to hospitals. And it was, in fact, the high rate of maternal deaths in hospitals in Tanzania, in the main referral hospital, Muhimbili, and a report written by some economist, I think it was UNICEF or that the World Bank started to shift its position slightly and said, oh, we ought to take account of the social dimensions of adjustment. Right? Another element of this structural adjustment and the fact that women have to pay to go to hospitals to give birth in crisis is the fact that women were detained in hospitals in many parts of Africa. And actually, even in Latin America, I found some examples in Brazil, where you go, you give birth, obviously if there's a complication, you go to the hospital, you give birth, you have your child, and they would lock you up in the hospital because you couldn't afford to pay the expenses. And this was a terrible scandal. And in fact, when I heard about it in Burundi, I was alarmed, and I started to look for examples. I found examples in Ghana and so on. And in fact, the Burundi government eventually changed its strategy to allow free medical care for maternal women. And I think some other governments might have. Right? But that was appalling. And when we're talking about the dignity of African lives, that's about the dignity of African lives. How can you give birth, right, and be imprisoned and detained? So there are lots of actions, I think, that we can take in relation to women.